Everyone's been waiting for the global recession since 2022. Central banks hiked rates faster than ever, inflation spiked, yield curves inverted, economists said it's coming any quarter now. But here we are, late 2025, and there's still no global recession. So what happened? Today in our agenda, we will cover why the crash was delayed, what is keeping global economies strong, and most importantly, how do you position your portfolio for whatever comes next, including stocks that could benefit. Stay tuned because in the next few seconds we will discuss a very unique feature about India's labour market that is widely considered a flaw, but this so-called flaw has kept the Indian economy strong while other developing economies struggle. Starting with the biggest reason behind the delay in a recession, the unexpected resilience of global economies. After COVID, households in the US, India and Europe had huge savings buffers from stimulus packages. This chart shows the amount of savings right after the COVID crash. They were the highest in history and by a significant margin. That's because the US printed $3.4 trillion on nearly 20% of all dollars in existence in just a few months. The result was an economy with an unprecedented level of strength that just refuses to buckle. Even after the central banks raised rates, the Indian job market in particular refused to collapse because of one unique feature, also called a flaw. About 80% of India's employment comes from the informal sector. These jobs have a distinct benefit that they can adjust more easily than formal jobs can. I personally saw people choosing to cut their salaries in half rather than lose their jobs. This could not happen anywhere else in the developed economies, and when combined with government support, this meant that our population did not sink into the chaos that engulfed our neighbors. This is how our banks and NBFCs managed to control their NPAs and survive the glut in credit growth. The recent rise of Eternal and Swiggy are all rooted in India's informal sector. This is also where it becomes very important to keep an eye on government reform in this space. I personally like both Swiggy and Zomato, but if the government tries to shift informal jobs into formal ones, these two companies' business model would collapse overnight. Coming back to our main area of concern though, the continued employment across the world meant that people kept spending, even as rates went up because they had an income. This spending prevented a full-blown recession even though manufacturing and exports slowed globally because of higher rates, wars and tariffs. In the US, for example, real GDP growth stayed positive largely due to resilient household consumption in services like travel, dining and healthcare. In India, robust consumption, especially from urban and upper middle class segments, kept GDP growth near 7% despite global headwinds. Stocks like Indian Hotels, Eternal and DLF have been direct beneficiaries from these spending patterns. However, as consumer spending slows, one must be careful in these companies directly. An indirect plane to a revival of consumption could now be the rural sector. Rural recovery can be played through Dabur, Hero MotoCorp and VST Tillers to cover the entire spectrum of rural consumption. Now, as people continued spending, central banks raised rates without breaking the system. Yes, we had a few scares, Silicon Valley Bank, Credit Suisse, but regulators stepped in fast. Unlike the great financial crisis, where central banks simply refused to step in because they thought banks were too big to fail. In the last 5 years, central banks stayed vigilant and came in to cover any cracks in the system immediately. For example, on 8th March, the Silicon Valley Bank announced a decimating loss in securities, and by 12th March, the Federal Reserve had covered all depositors. Liquidity was provided whenever and wherever needed. And while central banks protected the economy like Manuel Neuer protects Germany's posts, governments kept spending like Erling Haaland scores goals. US passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act along with the CHIPS Act. EU signed the Green Deal and Recovery and Resilience Facility along with massive spending in Ukraine. China continued heavy state-led investment in transport, energy and property stabilization. And India started a cycle of record Capex expansion into roads, rail, renewables and defense. The result? Instead of a synchronized crash, we got a rolling regional slowdown. Mild recessions in some places, strong growth in others. Most of this growth came from structural demand booms. New long-lived demand, especially from semiconductor or AI capex, the energy transition, defense spending, reshoring and public infrastructure. These created enough investment in construction and durable goods demand across different regions to offset weakness elsewhere. We will now look at how each of these sectors can continue to stave off a recession, what we should keep an eye on to spot when they might fail, and which stocks would benefit the most from them. For the semiconductor and AI capex, the mechanisms that continue to support demand are first, large and lumpy capex. Building fabs and data centers requires years of construction, huge orders of equipment, and long lead times. This generates sustained demand for construction equipment, materials, and high-skilled labor. Companies like Netweb Technologies and Thermax are particularly interesting in this space. Netweb Tech directly builds supercomputers which are essential for advanced AI and ML, while Thermax provides cooling solutions for data centers, an indirect beneficiary of the entire AI capex. This sector is also a high multiplier business, meaning semiconductor projects generate both downstream demand and upstream demand. test and packaging, automation, cloud services, specialty chemicals, and precision tools all benefit from spending on AI infrastructure. Stocks like Esconnect Technologies, Ether Industries, and ABB India stand to benefit from this space. Esconnect provides direct data centers, Ether makes specialty chemicals, and ABB's India's Genix suite is a pioneer in the field of operations and maintenance for industry. But the spillover of growth does not stop there. AI or data center builds also increase demand for professional services, software, cybersecurity, power and cooling engineers, for example. This is creating a wave of high-end employment that drives consumption. The global chip investment has continued to surge even in 2025, with both private and public investments amounting to hundreds of billions of dollars and large employers in host countries. For energy transition and renewables, the main mechanism of strength has been the very large investment envelope. IEA shows renewables, grid and storage spending in the trillions. These projects are capital intensive and labor heavy at installation stages. They also create long supply chains for steel, glass, electronics and batteries. Stocks like Amaraja Batteries, Borosil Renewables and JSW Steel stand to benefit here for very obvious reasons. Policy certainty and multi-year pipelines translate into predictable demand, which supports manufacturing, shipping, construction and O&M jobs for years. This is also a decentralized form of job creation, meaning this creates jobs in many localities instead of remaining concentrated just in metro cities, which cushions labor markets through tough times. Specifically in India, the National Solar Mission, Green Energy Corridor, Ujjwal India Mission and electric vehicle policy benefited stocks like Suzlon Energy, Power Grid and perhaps most importantly Tata Power. Ujjwal India Mission in particular aims to decentralize renewable power, basically installing solar cells on every rooftop so that even the remotest of villages can have access to power. Tata Power is the undisputed leader of this massive opportunity, and more on Tata Power later in this video. On defense and security spending, sharp policy-driven increases after 2022 reshaped demand very quickly. Defense spending is large, persistent, and supports high-tech manufacturing, shipyards, aerospace, and domestic supply chains. Defense contracts provide guaranteed revenues over many years, which keeps suppliers and salaried employees employed. While the defense may seem like a small sector, we must not belittle its impact. Total defense spending rose 50% in 4 years across the world to $2.7 trillion. This was the highest increase since the end of the Cold War, and companies like Solar Industries and BEL are still reaping rewards from those orders. Reshoring and Re-Industrialization, because of geopolitical risk, tariffs and pandemic, pushed firms to shorten supply chains or move production to friendlier geographies, bringing investment in factories, logistics, and industrial services to new locations. Reshoring triggers one-off construction booms, which is plant building for example, and recurring local procurement through materials and firms. This creates jobs and capacity. Reshoring data shows hundreds of thousands of manufacturing job announcements. India's diplomatic position has meant that we benefited from this very directly. Stocks like Dixon Tech, Redington India, and Arvind have been major beneficiaries from this realignment. Perhaps the biggest winners though have been our OMCs like IOC and BPCL. This is where we must also be very careful. As geopolitical tensions begin to fade, our OMCs will see their profits drop, so any investments there must be critically evaluated. Finally, public infrastructure and Capex, or broad government investment, has created direct employment in roads, railways, housing, ports, and this generates construction and material jobs as well. It's a demand multiplier because infrastructure raises demand for steel, cement, transport, and services. This is usually sustained spending that persists through business cycles. Stocks like Ultratech, Tata Steel, ONGC, and Coal India have been direct beneficiaries of government spending. Many governments have also deliberately increased Capex post-COVID to stabilize activity. India's large Capex programs is a perfect example of this. Counter-cyclical fiscal policy has been another driver for growth. Record Capex allocations for fiscal years 24-25 and 25-26, which is nearly 3.1% of GDP, has supported construction and railroad projects, directly creating jobs across geographies. Public infrastructure companies like SJVN continue to benefit from these inflationary policies. A curious investor would be wise to look at companies like PNC Infra, KNR Construction, and GR Infra though, who are trading at historically cheap valuations but also serve the same sector. But could these now start to fail? And if so, how would we know? We must keep an eye on the following signs. Pipeline cancellations or pause announcements will be a leading indicator. If semiconductor Capex announcements stop or infrastructure projects begin to get delayed, the job multiplier effect evaporates. The current circular investment ideology in chips is eerily reminiscent of an artificially created financial bubble. One would be wise to refrain from investing in this space until AI starts delivering revenue to match investment. Any slowdown in green project financing or permitting delays, policy or grid constraints would also be a leading indicator. Similarly, defense procurement cuts, which is through political shifts or through large overruns, can choke budgets, and that will show a weakening of the capex cycle. If costs of domestic production rise, some announced reshoring could be deferred, which would be negative for India, though positive probably for China. So where do we go from here? What are the possible scenarios, and what would be a game plan for each of these scenarios? Economists see three possible outcomes between now and 2026. The base case is where we do not get a deep recession, and there I would be 60% equity, 30% long-dated bonds or high dividend stocks, and 10% gold or silver. High beta sectors like metal, PSU banks, and IT should outperform. In a mild global recession, I would be 30% equity, 60% long-dated bonds, and 10% gold or silver. If you're solely an equity investor, I would replace the bonds with high dividend stocks like VSC Industries and PSUs. In a severe synchronized recession across the world, I would be 10% equity, 70% bonds or cash, and 10% gold and silver. This is my positioning at the moment. I believe the global recession hasn't hit yet, not because it's cancelled, but because the world has so far adapted.